Hey everyone, welcome to another IDW Retrospective video, part 4 to be precise, where we're looking at the Transformers Spotlight Series Volume 1, which contains the Spotlight issues for Shockwave, Nightbeat, Hot Rod, Sixshot, and Ultra Magnus. And this video is going to be a little different than the previous ones due to the contents. All the videos before this one focused on a specific story arc, whereas this one will look at 5 relatively self-contained stories published as Spotlight issues, with each one devoted to a specific character from the Transformers universe. I say they're self-contained, but that's mostly in the sense that there's no connected arc here between these 5 issues, unlike, say, the 7 issues of Infiltration or the 4 issues of Stormbringer. But that doesn't mean they're any less necessary to the overarching story. In fact, these 5 issues set up and flow into the main story, sometimes in fairly integral ways, both in terms of plot-specific events and with introducing as-of-yet unseen characters beyond the 5 named in the titles. And rather than split these up into 5 separate videos, I'm clumping them together, kind of like how IDW did when they published the trade paperbacks as Transformers Spotlight Volume 1. I think it makes sense to break down the Spotlight series this way, especially this first volume, as these 5 issues were released monthly between September of 2006 and January of 2007 as a mini-series of sorts intended to accompany the main series. And there's just one more thing to mention before we get into each issue here, and it's about the organization of this video. With previous videos, I had distinct sections with the synopsis, notes, and my thoughts in the review and analysis. With this one, due to the fractured narratives, I've integrated the notes into the synopsis for each issue. I think it just flows better happening in real time, if you will. I don't know. Hopefully it still works. I think it will, but we'll see. But that's enough of an introduction, so let's dig into these issues, starting with Spotlight Shockwave. This particular Spotlight begins with everyone's favorite purple Cyclops reflecting on the chain of events that brought him to the present moment. Long ago, as the Great War raged on Cybertron, Shockwave could see which way the wind was blowing. Much like Thunderwing in Transformers Stormbringer, Shockwave knew the price of the war was unsustainable and would deplete Cybertron's supply of energon and wreck the planet. Unlike Thunderwing, Shockwave kept his assessments to himself, knowing that he won't be listened to. The exact fate Thunderwing would later suffer when he came forward trying to solve the problem. Instead of involving others, Shockwave establishes a clandestine project he dubs Regenesis. His schemes and plans for Regenesis are vast and far-reaching. The gist of Regenesis is that it's a plan to distill an elemental catalyst from raw energon that will then be loaded into specialized warheads and launched towards specific planets in order to seed them with energon for future use, thus ensuring the survival of Cybertron, as well as controlling the outcome of the war. One of those planets with a compatible geological profile is prehistoric Earth, thus finally providing the answer as to where Ore-13 originated. But that whole process underlying Regenesis was slow going. After launching the warheads, Shockwave waits for what seems to be hundreds of thousands of years for the catalyst to take root before traveling to Earth to tend to his pet project. In what I always thought was a cool detail that reminded me of that fossil finder sonar thingy from early on in Jurassic Park, Shockwave fires what he refers to as global dampers into the ground to regulate the energon reaction within the planet. And although Earth contains massive and dangerous amounts of energon in the atmosphere, now where have I heard that before? Shockwave calculates that in time, the reaction will settle and the energon will become a plentiful and viable resource. But there's a catch. Shockwave's direct involvement in his secret project means he's abandoned his post and duties within the Decepticon Empire, actions that won't go unnoticed. Shockwave knows he will be branded a traitor, which only strengthens his resolve as the resource yield from Project Regenesis will consolidate power in Shockwave's hand, giving him the strength and leverage to direct the future of Cybertron. Despite his meticulous planning and calculating, however, there's one variable Shockwave didn't account for: chaos. Shockwave is oblivious to the fact that he was followed to Earth by the Dinobots. And that's Dinobots with a Y instead of an I at this point in the continuity, just to be clear. Beyond the Y in their name, these Dinobots aren't Dinobots in the traditional sense of having dinosaur alt modes. Yet, it's clear that they have Cybertronian vehicular forms at this point in the Spotlight issue, rather than their signature beast forms. These Cybertronian forms for the Dinobots are pulled directly from Don Figueroa's designs from the Dreamwave years, where he cleverly reimagined their G1 dinosaur features as Cybertronian vehicle parts. These designs were seen in Simon Furman's pre-Earth series War Within, published by Dreamwave across 3 volumes. Although the third was, sadly, never completed before the publisher's untimely demise. But enough trivia, let's turn our attention back to Spotlight Shockwave. Grimlock's out to settle an old score with Shockwave after an Energon heist went bad when the Decepticon, attempting to keep the resources out of the Dinobots' hands, detonated the Energon, with Grimlock and his crew wounded in the blast. Unable to observe what Shockwave is up to, or even set down on Earth due to the intense Energon levels that Shockwave apparently has specific personal shielding against, the Dinobots linger in orbit, with Grimlock telling Slag to do whatever it takes to find a way to get them onto the planet and have their revenge. In time, Slag finds the solution. By wrapping themselves in a synthetic equivalent of mammalian flesh and assuming alt modes adapted from local life forms, they should be adequately shielded from the Energon surge, which herds this issue fully into Beast Wars territory, just in case it wasn't already clear before. In an early hint of the anti-organic speciesism that would come to define Megatron and the Decepticon cause in later years of the IDW run, Grimlock is at first repulsed by the thought of debasing himself by imitating Earth animals, but relents when Slag assures him that there's no other way to get to Shockwave. But Grimlock demands more capable forms than the mammals Slag had selected, something with bite, as he puts it. Slag finds the fossilized remains of a Tyrannosaurus Rex, which, needless to say, catches Grimlock's eye. On the surface, Shockwave finishes placing the global dampers and attempts to summon his ship from orbit. When nothing happens, Shockwave hypothesizes that either his ship is experiencing a severe malfunction or it's been completely destroyed. Probably the latter, as the Dinobots soon teleport down, transforming into their newly acquired dinosaur forms, or beast modes, as Grimlock yells, and attack the Decepticon scientist. Throughout this fight, we see weaponry popping out of compartments from the Dinobots' beast modes that reminds me of the integrated or hidden weaponry gimmicks of the Kenner toy line from the 90s. And those are some pretty cool toys, weren't they? Anyway, the Dinobots hit Shockwave with everything they have, with a ferocity that sends the Decepticon's mind reeling as he struggles to find a logical explanation for this unexpected contingency that escaped his careful preparations. Through the din of combat, Shockwave makes out fragments of bitter recriminations, which eventually lead him to recall the events following the Dinobots' Energon raid. Shockwave realizes this is all about revenge, and the illogical and extreme lengths the Dinobots have gone to in order to see it realized is enough to make the preternaturally emotionless Decepticon shut down his higher mental functions and give in to an uncharacteristic primal fury that gives him a big enough boost to lay waste to his opponents, transforming into gun mode to administer the coup de grace. The blast strips the Dinobots of their protective synthetic skins, leaving them vulnerable to the dangerous energon levels of Earth. Victorious, Shockwave's mind clears, though the rush of satisfaction from giving in to his rage remains. Grimlock, the last Dinobot standing, makes one last-ditch effort to stop Shockwave, but his systems are quickly overloaded and he's sent into stasis lock. As he grabs the Dinobot shuttle remote, Shockwave reflects on this encounter, breaking it down into identifiable data, but again fails to consider the same variable: chaos. What that means in this case is that Grimlock keyed in an auto-firing sequence. In the event that the Dinobots failed, Grimlock wanted to be sure Shockwave couldn't walk away. As Shockwave attempts to summon the craft, it unleashes a blast on a nearby volcano that triggers an explosion that buries Shockwave and the Dinobots in pools of magma. Meanwhile, on Cybertron, Megatron tells Bludgeon that Shockwave has gone missing, and it's imperative that they learn why and what he was working on. Because of this, he has sealed and archived all of Shockwave's data and tasks Bludgeon with sifting through it all for answers, a job that Bludgeon is more than happy to accept. Time passes, and in 2006, at a Eureka, Nevada archaeological dig site, an inert, gigantic mechanical purple hand is unearthed. And that stinger is the close of Spotlight Shockwave. In terms of continuity, I think it's safe to say that the bulk of this issue, excluding the ending in 2006, occurs before Thunderwing showing sounds the alarm about Cybertron's collapse seen throughout the flashback sequences in Stormbringer. I think that's worth pointing out because it shows how ahead of the curve Shockwave was in regard to Cybertron's fate, and why he was absent during the bipartisan meeting of the minds Thunderwing called together, as seen in the flashback for Stormbringer number 1, because Shockwave was likely trapped in lava by that point. Which really makes sense when you think about it. I mean, what? You're going to invite Mixmaster and Swerve to a meeting of the planet's best and brightest scientific minds and not Shockwave? Yeah, right. And that chronological placement is reinforced by the cut to Cybertron at the end of the issue when Megatron assigns Bludgeon the task of de-archiving Shockwave's encrypted projects, which of course sets in motion Bludgeon eventually uncovering OR-13 and subsequently using it to reactivate Thunderwing. The fact that this short scene is set on Cybertron means that it must occur prior to the collapse and exodus from the planet. Moving on, as I've touched on already, there are more than a few Beast Wars nods in this Spotlight issue, but there are some in the beginning that I didn't touch on yet because I wanted to go into a bit more detail. The first is Shockwave's ship. Although we only get a very brief look at it, I think it's safe to say that Shockwave's vessel has a bee or wasp-like appearance, and at first I thought maybe this was a nod to Beast Wars Scorponok's bee drone, but it could also be a nod to Waspinator himself. After all, inside the ship, his keyboard has a very distinctive design and shape, reminiscent, to me anyway, of Waspinator's eyes. This stood out to me because, in an odd coincidence, Waspinator will be introduced in Phase 2, where he'll play a role in Shockwave's plans during the Dark Cybertron event. While there are certainly a number of Beast Wars nods, Spotlight Shockwave also draws on the Marvel Comics run in a satisfyingly nostalgic way. Back then, it was revealed in issue 4 that, despite the crash, Ark's defensive systems were still operational, and they detected Shockwave in the Savage Land. And there's even a somewhat similar-looking panel between the two issues with Shockwave amongst the local life forms. Anyway, in response to detecting the Decepticon, the Ark reconfigured and activated 5 warriors: Grimlock, Slag, Snarl, Sludge, and Swoop, turning them into the Dinobots and dispatching them to defeat Shockwave. In the ensuing battle near some conveniently located tar pits, Snarl would bring a mountain down upon the Dinobots and Shockwave, burying the combatants in rock and tar, rendering them inoperational for millions of years. So you can see that there are parallels between Spotlight Shockwave and the Marvel Comics in terms of the premise and how the showdown between Shockwave and the Dinobots plays out. But that's about all I have for Spotlight Shockwave for now. We'll circle back for some final thoughts during the review and analysis section, but right now, let's move on to Spotlight Nightbeat. Spotlight Nightbeat begins with the Autobot detective receiving an offer for an ancient artifact from an adventurer mechanoid named Kraken, who was fatally wounded just prior to when he was scheduled to meet up with the Autobot. Investigating the crime scene aboard Kraken's ship, Nightbeat uncovers a mystery in the orbit of a planet named Gorlum Prime. With his dying words, Kraken cryptically told Nightbeat that there's a hole in the world. Loving a good mystery, Nightbeat examines the scene of the crime, determining that Kraken died of peculiar causes, as if the life was sucked out of him. And whoever murdered Kraken also took the artifact Nightbeat was interested in buying. The artifact in question was purportedly the flight recorder from the first arc, an interstellar expedition from ancient Cybertron intended to plot safe passage to the Benzuli expanse. The arc never completed its journey, vanishing without a trace. Solving the mystery of what happened to the first arc and its crew is of significant personal value to Nightbeat. It was why he was drawn to the rendezvous with Kraken in the first place, and why he decides to investigate Gorlum Prime for further clues. After reconfiguring his alt mode to blend in with vehicles on Gorlum Prime, Nightbeat arrives on the surface of the planet via orbital bounce to investigate excavation sites listed in Kraken's logs. Strangely enough, Nightbeat's antennae disappear when he lands on Gorlum Prime. I'm not sure if that's an error or an intentional thing because he changed his form for disguise, but I'm leaning towards it being a goof. Regardless, this little detail cuts surprisingly deep because I had a G1 Nightbeat as a kid and I pretty quickly lost the little hat and antenna that sat atop the figure's headmaster. So when I see him drawn this way, it's like I'm back in the pants. Unlike my childhood self, however, artist MD Bright would inexplicably find Nightbeat's antenna by the end of the issue, thus ensuring top dollar potential on eBay. But back to the plot. Once on the planet, Nightbeat finds a technologically advanced world populated by a species of biological humanoids that have progressed so far that they've begun upgrading their bodies with cybernetic enhancements. The speed of evolution at work on Gorlum Prime prompts another mystery in that it appears that evolution here had a helping hand. Arriving at the 4th excavation site, Nightbeat detects Cybertronian debris dating back to the time of the first arc scattered around a mechanical underground shaft that is much older than the surrounding geology. Nightbeat begins to suspect that he might have been lured here and creates a log of his findings so far, transmitting it back to his ship as a record before descending underground. As the detective will soon learn, his intuition is correct, as he is secretly being tailed and observed by 4 unidentified Transformers. These characters are actually pre-existing characters from the tail end of the G1 toy line known as Micromasters, Hasbro's answers to Micro Machines, and yet another attempt to spice up the brand with new ideas and concepts that build off the basic robots in disguise premise. The 4 characters shown here are Blackjack, Detour, Hyperdrive, and Roadhugger, who made up the Decepticon Sports Car Patrol in the original toy line. In this Spotlight issue, they're presented as smaller but more advanced Cybertronians, quick, deadly, and of mysterious origin. We'll see more Micromaster characters when we return to Gorlin Prime and Spotlight Hardhead, as well as a spattering of characters unrelated to these mysterious groups seen later on in the IDW run, with some, like Fix-It and Stakeout, lacking the same diminutive stature or advanced capabilities as the ones we see here. Below ground, Nightbeat discovers a vast network of tunnels built to accommodate Cybertronian-sized beings. The Autobot knows he should withdraw and call in backup, but his curiosity gets the better of him, and he proceeds into an enormous chamber filled with a strange glowing liquid. Kraken's dying words about there being a hole in the world come back to the detective as he hypothesizes that this is a dimensional portal. As he wades into the liquid, he's overcome with an awareness of something long dead and a feeling that it's time to leave. His pursuers have other plans in store, however, finally making their presence known. Assessing them to be some form of advanced new kind of Cybertronian, Nightbeat briefly attempts to communicate with the group, but soon senses something menacing rising out of the liquid behind him and attempts to flee the caverns. His diminutive pursuers quickly catch up to the Autobot detective and attempt to incapacitate him. Nightbeat tries to evade the group by making a sudden turn down a passage he realizes too late is a dead end. An unknown entity welcomes the Autobot, informing him that his arrival was expected and assuring him that the answers to all his questions can be found here. As Nightbeat reaches for his gun, an attack renders him unconscious, and he's carried off by the sports car patrol. Drifting in and out of consciousness, Nightbeat is aware that he is somewhere bad, and that he's immobile and helpless to stop his captors from installing a cerebral implant into his head. He catches fragments of conversation, among them mentions of the expansion and a dead universe, as well as a command that when there is need of Nightbeat, he will be summoned to perform the role he's been assigned. Then Nightbeat blacks out, and later simply resumes his solitary life aboard his spacecraft, with no memory of his trip to Gorlin Prime or his captivity and modification. As he considers dusting off one of the big 3 mysteries to occupy his mind, Nightbeat receives a call from Optimus Prime, commanding him to meet up with the crew of Arc 32. Prime has a new assignment for him on a planet called Earth. Nightbeat makes a pained sound as he experiences what he assures Optimus is merely a minor cerebral surge. Ending the transmission, Nightbeat harbors doubts about the dismissive explanation he provided, unable to shake the feeling that he's found himself in the middle of a mystery and there's some detail or clue that he's missing. A nearby monitor indicates that a carrier wave transmission has been received from Gamma 04, the 4th excavation site on Gorlin Prime, where Nightbeat sent his message just in case something happened to him. And the story comes to a close for now. Although he was never in the Sunbow or Japanese cartoon continuities, I think Nightbeat counts as a moderately well-known character, at least to fans of the Marvel Comics, where he was utilized as a detective to great effect in several of Furman's stories in both the US and UK titles. Nightbeat was part of the 1988 product line of Autobot Headmasters, so you have to appreciate the irony of this character being the one who had his head tinkered with in this issue. Obviously, there's going to be more to of this story in the larger sense, but there are also some smaller things here that Furman planted that would bear fruit later, like the bit about Nightbeat musing that his curiosity may be the death of him. This is definitely foreshadowing, but it's technically foreshadowing twice over. First, as a likely intentional and direct instance of Furman's plans for the character, and second, as something that James Roberts would return to in the pages of Lost Light during Phase 3. And Nightbeat talking about dusting off one of his big three mysteries is another example. I suspect this was just a little character building detail Furman threw in, but Roberts would later reveal what Nightbeat's big three mysteries are. So it's just kind of cool seeing later writers latch onto a seemingly throwaway detail from earlier in the continuity that could have just easily been swept aside and forgotten. This issue also sets up the existence and mystery of the first arc. The term arc seems to be a designation for Autobot vessels in this continuity, followed by a specific numeric identifier, such as Arc 19, which is where Prowl's crew is stationed during the events of infiltration, and Arc 32, which Nightbeat is dispatched towards at the end of this issue. Needless to say, that first arc is important to Cybertron's past as well as its future, and what happened to it all those millions of years ago is going to be extremely relevant to the story in future issues. And that takes us to Spotlight Hot Rod, where we meet the character on a personal mission to land on a Decepticon-held moon, a feat that, in Hot Rod's estimation, would be considered totally impossible by most. To Hot Rod, however, it's a challenge he's all too eager to accept. He chooses the riskiest, most suicidal option possible, partially out of tactical necessity and partially because he relishes high-stakes thrills. His plan is to ride into the moon's orbit on a meteor shower, counting on appearing as nothing more than space debris to any Decepticon sensors. To avoid detection, he waits until the last possible moment before activating a null field, which is presumably some kind of shield, to soften his landing. Needless to say, the stunt almost leaves him in critical system shock. As he tries to pull himself together and focus, his thoughts take him back to a memory he's relived over and over. His first time leading a tactical unit for a special mission at the Silicon Steps of Kyaletta. The team consisted of Hot Rod, Gizmo, Download, Backbeat, and Dealer. Gizmo, Download, and Backbeat are all new Autobot characters created specifically for this issue, but spoiler alert, don't get too attached, as Furman's original characters usually meet a quick end not long after being introduced. Not always, but usually and definitely in this case. Dealer, as you may already know, comes from an existing character, but we'll circle back to him in a bit, so for now let's continue breaking down Hot Rod's mission. The Autobots had been dispatched to a region of Kyaletta racked by harsh geological storms to locate a site known as the Omega Bunker. Their mission was to slip past the automated security golems, the ancient and lethal Omega Guardians, and retrieve an object called the Magnificence. Everything seemed to be going off without a hitch, with each member of the team in position to perform their designated tasks like consummate professionals. As Hot Rod's systems stabilize in the present day, he reflects on his overzealous attitude he brought to the mission on Kyaletta, wondering if that's what doomed the mission and got his team killed. Hot Rod brings his focus back to the task at hand, which is yet another supposedly impossible feat, infiltrating the Decepticon penal colony known as Styx. He fires a device into the air which lands on top of a central structure. Upon impact, the device activates itself and transmits a virus carrier wave into the Styx security system, creating what appears to be a random series of outages and false alarms. But these events have all been carefully timed and plotted by Hot Rod in order to allow him to slip into the facility undetected and make his way towards cell block Z lateral. As he cuts through a wall, Hot Rod's mind wanders back to the events on Kyaletta, trying as he has many times before to identify where the mission fell apart. After the drones had drilled tunnels into the Omega Bunker, Gizmo, Backbeat, and Dealer remained outside, using hollow matter decoys and synced charges to draw the attention of the Omega Guardians, providing a distraction for Hot Rod and Download to slip inside the chamber housing the Magnificence. The Magnificence is an all-knowing artifact, one that can provide the answer to any question that's posed to it. That's really all we find out about it for now, as Furman likely intended it to be a rather straightforward MacGuffin, but it will be revealed much, much later in Phase 3 of the IDW continuity that the Magnificence actually has important ties to Cybertron's ancient past, so keep that in mind for later. All you need to know for now is that Autobot intelligence determined that the Decepticons were trying to acquire the Magnificence and put its fortune-telling powers to nefarious use in their quest for dominating the galaxy, prompting the Autobots to steal it first in order to keep it out of their enemies' hands. As Download attempted to disable the containment field surrounding the Magnificence, the holomatter generator malfunctioned suddenly and exploded, causing the decoys to vanish and leaving the team vulnerable to the Omega Guardians. More Guardians converged on the inner sanctum of the bunker, killing Download immediately after the Autobot managed to lower the containment field. Hot Rod's attention is snapped back to the present as the virus he deployed opens every cell door in Styx, putting the facility on high alert. Hot Rod did his homework for this mission, discovering that standard operating procedure in case of such an incident is to evacuate high-ranking officers to a remote location and wait for a team to arrive to re-secure the facility. This affords Hot Rod the opportunity to move with greater ease within the penal colony, but just to be on the safe side, he activates a holographically generated disguise, assuming the identity of a Decepticon to pass through the rest of the facility. Hot Rod makes his way to Cell Block Z Lateral, finding it quiet. He assumes that's either because the prisoners don't know this is anything more than a routine inspection, or they've been broken by their Decepticon jailers to the point that they're too weak or scared to flee. Hot Rod tries to put the other Autobots in these cells out of his mind, knowing he can't save them all. Instead, he focuses on finding the one bot who, once he learned was still alive, put everything he had into this rescue mission. The one bot who can provide a small measure of redemption for what happened on Kyaletta, the sole survivor, Dealer. During the mission on Kyaletta, Dealer had radioed Hot Rod for help, but Hot Rod had top-secret orders to secure the Magnificence at all cost, and that meant using an escape route known only to himself. Putting his personal feelings aside, Hot Rod followed his orders and left his fellow Autobot behind, assuming that Dealer perished with the rest of his unit. Although Hot Rod was cleared of blame by the official report of the incident, he held himself accountable and always wondered if the Autobots serving under him after that could ever really trust him as their leader. Later, when he learned Dealer was still alive and being held in Styx, Hot Rod devoted all his efforts to the rescue mission, feeling that this small gesture was the only way he could move past his failures and trust himself as a leader again. Using the same holographic disguise tech on Dealer, Hot Rod helps the imprisoned Autobot to a Decepticon ship, dispatching the actual Decepticon whose identity he stole, then commandeers the ship, taking off and escaping from Styx, thus once again accomplishing the impossible. Time passes, and once Dealer is well enough, Hot Rod visits him to apologize for leaving him behind on Kyaletta. Dealer doesn't hesitate to forgive Hot Rod, expressing his gratitude at saving him from Styx, and hoping that the two of them can become friends. Later still, Dealer, transmitting to Bonzaitron, assures the Decepticon that Hot Rod has completely fallen for their ruse. Not only was Dealer placed in Styx as bait, but he was the one who sabotaged the mission on Kyaletta. If Hot Rod didn't follow his orders, or have a secret escape plan, Dealer would have killed him too, and stolen the Magnificence for Bonzaitron's secret service. Now, in befriending Hot Rod, Dealer hopes to finally recover the location of the Magnificence. Impressed by Dealer's duplicitous nature, Bonzaitron suggests that perhaps the double agent should be called Doubledealer instead. If you aren't familiar with the characters already, Bonzaitron debuted in 1990 as part of the Action Master line of toys, which were non-transforming action figures packaged with transforming accessories and vehicles. This is Bonzaitron's first appearance in the IDW universe, and we wouldn't see much of him, but as the head of the Decepticon Secret Service, he's obviously somewhat important, and Furman would weave him in and out of stories throughout his run. This is also the first appearance of Dealer, who was adapted from the 1988 character known as Doubledealer, who was a triple changer, double power master, and a double agent all rolled into one. So, bit of an overachiever, this guy. He never appeared in the original cartoon, and as far as comics goes, he only showed up once in a Marvel UK story, where he pulled off an elaborate deception involving secret Autobot plans, ensuring he would be paid for his services twice, once from the Autobots, and again from the Decepticons. In that Marvel UK story, he had two identities. The first, Dealer, the Decepticon with a beast mode that kidnapped Chainclaw, who was carrying the Autobot plans. Dealer held both Chainclaw and the plans for ransom from the Autobots. His second identity was Double, the Autobot who volunteered to deliver the ransom and retrieve the plans, as well as Chainclaw. Spotlight Hot Rod seems to draw some inspiration from the Marvel UK story, although Doubledealer seems more firmly ensconced with the Decepticons in the IDW continuity. It seems like he's technically still a free agent, but it really feels like his portrayal here is that of a Decepticon posing as an Autobot, rather than a merc manipulating both sides. And there's definitely some more story to be told here with Hot Rod and Doubledealer, though unfortunately not as much as I would like, but that will all occur in future issues. So, for now, we turn our attention to the penultimate Spotlight issue from this first volume, Spotlight Sixshot. The fourth Spotlight issue, Spotlight Sixshot, features the character that was introduced in the 1987 product line, and as implied by his name, his whole gimmick revolves around being able to transform into 6 modes. In his appearance in Part 1 of the Rebirth series, Galvatron tells Sixshot to show the aerial bots what a one-robot army is before he uses each of his modes to trash each of the Autobot flyers. Although he technically needed Cyclonus' help to hold him in gun mode to take out Silverbolt, so I don't know how proud he should really be of that whole one-robot army thing. Nevertheless, that concept of a one-robot army would be applied quite literally in the IDW continuity, as Sixshot is, at this point in the publication timeline, the most powerful Decepticon in Megatron's ranks, capable of destroying entire worlds on his own. He is what would become later known as a Phase Sixer, unstoppable warriors deployed during Phase 6 of the Decepticon Infiltration Protocol, which consists of full-on devastation and total conquest. After Furman's departure, the concept of Phase Sixers as well as other Decepticon Phase Sixer characters will be introduced, but at this point in the publishing chronology, Sixshot appears to be one of a kind, something that no doubt contributes to his barren existence. As the inside cover of Spotlight Sixshot reads, his life is defined by his sheer, almost limitless capacity for destruction and mayhem. With 6 distinct alt forms, all of lethal design and intent, he is one of a kind, feared almost equally by both Autobot adversaries and Decepticon allies. He is, in every sense of the expression, a living weapon. But he is also alone, isolated, and shunned. His name is Sixshot. The beginning of this Spotlight issue finds Sixshot in the grips of something akin to existential boredom. Without planetary devastation to pass the time, Sixshot has nothing to distract himself from the gaping hole of ennui within himself. Feared and shunned by his fellow Decepticons, Sixshot also doesn't seem to have much of a social life, or any friends at all, really, with the exception of the 5 Terrorcons, Hunger, Rippersnapper, Blot, Sinner Twin, and Cutthroat, who happen to be super fans of the living weapon, despite Sixshot's best attempts to push them away. However, the Terrorcons seem to have suddenly disappeared, and Sixshot decides to find out why. Squawkbox tells Sixshot that the Terrorcons were dispatched to a planet named Mumu Obscura. The planet has since been devastated by a group known as the Reapers. Sixshot sets out to determine the fate of the Terrorcons, but has an ulterior motive to learn more about these mysterious and deadly beings that laid waste to Mumu Obscura, and he will eventually learn plenty about them. The Reapers are a group of legendary mechanoids who exist only to destroy worlds, determined to be strategically important in galactic wars in the name of ending war forever, which doesn't really make a lot of sense when you think about it, so yeah, probably not the brightest bulbs, these Reapers. While we're talking about this team, there are 2 of these guys that specifically catch my attention here. This dude with a lower body consisting only of tank treads reminds me of Bonebreaker from the Reavers, a group of X-Men villains, but I guess you could also look at him as a kind of Johnny Five from hell, if you like. The leader of the Reapers, Deathbringer, shares his namesake with a character from the Marvel Comics run who appeared in both the US and UK titles. There, Deathbringer was a mechanical being that eased the suffering of the terminally ill. Fatally wounded, Marvel Deathbringer was recreated by the Lost Creation Matrix, its prime directive perverted in the process, creating a being that sought to destroy all life. While the origin of the Marvel version of Deathbringer was explained, IDW's version of Deathbringer doesn't get the same treatment. None of the Reapers do, for that matter. The mystery of where they came from was never explored, and I can't help but wonder if they might have been more important if Furman's run had lasted longer. Anyway, this Deathbringer sports a design with little tying it back to the Marvel version of the character, although the visor does seem to be inspired by the classic Deathbringer. Anyway, after battling through the Reaper's security perimeter, Sixshot is stunned by the degree of destruction wrought on the planet, leaving no exploitable resources, no possibility for life to grow, nothing left but a completely dead world. The Reapers welcome Sixshot, and Deathbringer tells the Decepticon that his Terrorcon allies are still alive and will be returned if Sixshot can best the Reapers in combat. Sixshot manages to hold his own, but the battle was really just an elaborate test to determine if Sixshot was worthy of joining the Reapers, and the Decepticon passed that test with flying colors. Appealing to the existential crisis Sixshot was experiencing at the start of the issue, Deathbringer says, "We are, or were, the same as you, Sixshot. All of us compelled by unnatural instincts, locked in a cycle of destruction, isolation, desperation, and almost inevitably madness. We determined to break that cycle, redirect our murderous proclivities. Sixshot's initiation requires that he ice the Terrorcons, something that the Decepticon seems to give serious thought to, before ultimately telling the Reapers to pound sand in his own distinctive way. But even after making his decision, Sixshot still feels the pull to join the Reaper's cause, but stands by his decision to save his comrades, as their presence reminds Sixshot that his Decepticon badge still means something, and that he is still capable of feeling one thing at least: empathy for some of his allies. A feeling the Decepticon Six-Changer decides is enough. For the time being, anyway. And so we come to the last Spotlight issue that we'll be covering today, Spotlight Ultra Magnus. This fifth Spotlight follows Ultra Magnus as he attempts to bring Scorponok to justice. This issue sets up some aspects of the character of Ultra Magnus that would persist throughout the IDW run. This is the first instance of the character being a duly appointed enforcer of the Tyrest Accord, a title that will continue to define him in the years after Furman's departure, playing into an arc involving Magnus and Tyrest himself in More Than Meets the Eye. We also get a hint of Magnus's regard for rules and regulations in this issue, a trait that will be emphasized and exaggerated in More Than Meets the Eye, usually for comedic effect. This particular Spotlight issue almost feels like a space western to me, with Magnus as the intergalactic lawman pursuing criminals attempting to flee to distant planets. The story opens with one such scenario on the planet Zol, which is apparently one gigantic fortress, with Swindle seeking protection from an organic alien named Karzai Lorcha and his band of space thugs who occupy and run Zol. Swindle is wanted for dealing in outlawed weaponry, and Magnus has arrived on Zol to bring the Decepticon in. Magnus makes short work of Zol's forces and, after a brief skirmish, detains Swindle and warns Lorcha to stop offering asylum to wanted criminals or he'll be back to, in his words, bring the walls of Zol tumbling down. Later, Swindle attempts to cut a deal with Magnus, information in exchange for his release. Ultra Magnus is committed to remaining unbending in his morals and ethics, initially dismissing the Decepticon's offer outright. However, when Swindle name-drops Scorponok, it gives the duly appointed enforcer of the Tyrest Accord pause. You see, Magnus views Scorponok as something of a dark reflection of himself, whereas the Autobot seeks only to maintain order and enforce the rules of interplanetary conflict, which prohibit the sharing of Cybertronian tech with other species. Scorponok seemingly only exists to break those rules, forging alliances with unscrupulous types to create new technologies. Although Magnus is reticent about compromising his ethics, ultimately he decides that Scorponok is the bigger fish to fry in this scenario. Magnus releases Swindle in exchange for information on Scorponok's whereabouts, but is sure to leave Swindle with a secret parting gift, a tracker, so that when the Decepticon inevitably gets into trouble again, Ultra Magnus will have no problems arresting him once more. Swindle's intel takes Magnus to the Zarak Consortium, a corporation on the planet Nebulos. This marks the second time we've seen Nebulos in this continuity, with the first being a fleeting glimpse in Stormbringer number 2 before Thunderwing promptly lays waste to an indeterminate portion of the planet's civilization. Spotlight Ultra Magnus is set prior to the events of Stormbringer, 29 stellar cycles to be precise, which I just read as roughly 29 years, but if you go back to that old forum post by Furman that I've referenced a couple times across a couple videos now, a stellar cycle shakes out to being about 7.5 months, which here would translate to roughly 18 and a half years, and I don't think it really matters, so pick your poison as far as how you want to count the time. But the point is, this spotlight being set in the recent past means we get to spend a bit more time on Nebulos before Thunderwing's attack, and get a glimpse of what that civilization was, which is pretty cool. And this little slice of Nebulos is the Zarak Consortium, a corporation hiding a more sinister inner circle of Nebulan researchers and scientists known as the Cranium, which seems like a wink and a nod to the Nebulans' role as headmasters in the Marvel comic and G1 cartoon. The chairman, Zarak, is in name and appearance taken from G1 fiction, particularly the Sunbow cartoon as far as his appearance goes, but he's reimagined here as chairman of the Zarak Corporation. In the cartoon, his inner circle was known as the Hive rather than the Cranium, and the Hive could control machines with their minds, an ability they used to try and exert dominance over Nebulos. We never learn the exact nature of what Zarak and Scorponok are working on, or what they hope to achieve, but it seems likely that, once we see him again in future issues, Scorponok aims to replicate or repurpose the bulk of the work done here on Nebulos. That research will have major implications for the story going forward, and Ultra Magnus is the first to uncover it here in this issue. Using his holomatter avatar, Magnus infiltrates the heart of the corporation's labs, where he discovers a Nebulan who has been so extensively modified and cybernetically enhanced that he appears capable of transforming, much like Cybertronians. However, this top-secret area has much more stringent security, and Ultra Magnus's cover is blown quite quickly as a result, prompting the Autobot to take a louder, more forceful approach, dispatching security mechs and traveling deep underground for a confrontation with Scorponok. Needless to say, Scorponok handily disarms Magnus and gives the Autobot the beatdown of his life until Zarak intervenes, imploring Scorponok to stop before the fighting destroys their work. Zarak picked the absolute worst time to run into the fray, however, and the Decepticon accidentally blasts his Nebulan ally with his tail laser, killing him. In the G1 fiction, Zarak was the headmaster component of Scorponok, and while it appears this particular Zarak was cybernetically modified, the two don't seem to be as intricately connected as they were in G1, physically at least. Zarak and Scorponok clearly had a bond here, as Scorponok becomes visibly distraught at having murdered his ally. The accident gives Magnus enough time to recover his gun and deal a critical blow to Scorponok's head, something Magnus assesses should have put the Decepticon down, but Scorponok is made of sterner stuff and manages to escape through a portal, his coordinates automatically erased, leaving Magnus unable to follow. Ultra Magnus vows to bring Scorponok to justice, whatever it takes. But as time goes by, he begins to wonder with some trepidation, perhaps, how far he'll go to uphold that vow. 29 stellar cycles later, Ultra Magnus has apprehended Swindle yet again, reporting the arrest to an unknown entity. Well, unknown in the context of this issue for this video. This issue was published after Escalation number 1, where we see this report being sent to Optimus Prime. The issue ends with Swindle offering to cut another deal, although it's undermined slightly by Swindle's final line of dialogue being randomly duplicated in this panel directly preceding his appearance, an error that was not corrected in IDW's complete collection for some reason. It's kind of sloppy and unfortunate that they couldn't get that fixed in a later edition, but what are you going to do? Anyway, that concludes Spotlight Ultra Magnus, wrapping up the last issue of Volume 1 of the IDW's Transformers Spotlight series, and bringing us to the final section of this video, the review and analysis. So this first batch of Spotlight issues is notable for expanding the IDW universe even further than Stormbringer, the previous outing. Something that I really enjoy about these issues is that they weave in and out of the main story being told in the ongoing series in some pretty interesting ways. The bulk of them feed into future storylines, both intentionally during Furman's run, but also beyond Furman's tenure on the comics, with James Roberts and John Barber picking up some of the details and threads present around here and carrying on with them in their own way, from Regenesis to the Magnificence, as well as the duly appointed enforcer of the Tyrest Accord. You could even argue that Shockwave's idiosyncratic and detached way of viewing his emotions in his Spotlight issue unintentionally sets the stage for when the concept of shadowplay is introduced in Phase 2, but I digress. Having read everything that follows these stories, it's easy to see how they set up future events that Furman had planned, but if you were reading them for the first time, it might be less clear, and some of these stories might seem more self-contained than they actually are. Specifically, I appreciate how Spotlight Ultra Magnus foreshadows Scorponok's return in the ongoing, although it might only really be obvious in retrospect once you've read Escalation and Devastation, but there's a lot here with Scorponok infiltrating the Zarak Corporation that parallels his ties to Epsilon Holdings and the Machination and their experiments. Furman even casually tosses out a line about Scorponok's machinations in Spotlight Ultra Magnus, which seems like it had to be intentional. In terms of integrating into the main story, though, it's hard not to hold up Spotlight Shockwave as a shining example of the potential of such an approach. I could see an argument being made for this being the best Spotlight issue, maybe not just in Volume 1, but out of all of the ones that IDW released, purely for how well it succeeds in tying into what happened previously, feeding into what will happen in the future, and existing as its own story. Spotlight Shockwave definitely answers questions about Or-13's origins that had been lingering since Infiltration introduced the substance, while also setting up the return of Shockwave and the Dinobots in the main series. It's an essential, invaluable companion to the story being told, and ties into the ongoing series in a very satisfying way. It's a phenomenal issue, but I'm actually not sure if it's my personal favorite from this bunch. I might have to give that distinction to Spotlight Ultra Magnus, because I just really love the premise of that issue and how it's executed. But ultimately, I like all of the stories in this first collection of Spotlight issues, though some more than others. And I have to say that Spotlight Sixshot is the weak link here, in my opinion. It's a necessary story that sets up the events of Devastation, but it just doesn't grab me. Every time I read it, I have a lukewarm response. I don't hate it, but I'm not crazy about it either. First of all, despite everything that happens in the issue and how it tries to set Sixshot up as the ultimate badass, I don't think it does a great job of succeeding in that endeavor. I think Devastation is a much better showcase for Sixshot's capabilities and reputation. It's also hard not to look at the issue knowing where the setup actually goes in terms of Sixshot and the Reapers, which is pretty much nowhere at all. How the whole thing with the Reapers plays out in Devastation feels really truncated and unsatisfying, retroactively making Sixshot's Spotlight issue that much more disappointing, knowing that what it's building up to ultimately just kind of fizzles out and is never brought up again. The Reapers could have been a cool addition to the IDW continuity, but very little was done with them, and their whole justification for doing what they do is just kind of lame. I mean, their whole thing is that they want to stop intergalactic war, so they destroy strategically desirable planets? I don't know, man, maybe I just don't get it. The reasoning behind their actions is not the most compelling motivation ever, and it's made worse by the fact that their existence really means nothing and truly leads to nothing in the grand scheme of the larger story. Now, that might be due to Furman's run being cut off prematurely. Maybe he had more in mind for them, or at least getting into where they came from, who created them, something, anything. But that's moot at this point, because all we have is what we got. And this is an even more petty complaint that I have with Sixshot's issue, but what a truly lackluster use of the Terrorcons. They don't even really do anything except stand there. Come on, man. But let's not dwell on the negative. Spotlight Hot Rod, on the other hand, is another highlight worth mentioning. And I have to say that a big reason why is down to how Furman approached the character. In a June 2006 interview, Furman made a comment about his approach to developing these characters for the IDW continuity in general, but also mentioned Hot Rod specifically, saying, "I've taken key elements of the character, brash, hot-headed, cocky, and gone in a whole new direction with what makes him tick and what kind of hothead he is. I really want to defy longtime fans' expectations and give new readers a sense that they're getting a whole character from scratch." And I think you could take this further. Not only does the Hot Rod of this Spotlight issue exemplify key elements of the original character, but the story, in some ways, mirrors the arc the character went through during the 1986 animated movie, where after Hot Rod's brazen attempt to play hero backfires with fatal consequences, the rest of the movie is about finding finding redemption and growing up in a figurative as well as literal sense, maturing into an Autobot leader. Now, Hot Rod doesn't become Rodimus Prime by the end of Spotlight Hot Rod or open the Matrix or destroy Unicron or anything crazy like that, but obviously, he nonetheless goes on a similar journey of proving to himself and others that he's still worthy of being an Autobot and still worthy of being a leader. There's a line towards the end where Hot Rod narrates, "Maybe, just maybe, I've found a way back." And I've always liked that line because it finds him reflecting on how he couldn't trust himself to lead a team again without finding some measure of atonement. Now, of course, Furman adds an interesting twist to that arc by essentially making it all an elaborate scam. Hot Rod is laboring under the illusion that he's personally responsible for the mission failure, and sure, maybe you could argue that you shouldn't bring along the sketchy guy that clearly looks like a Decepticon, but really, the failure of the mission was down to Doubledealer's betrayal, something that none of the Autobots anticipated. That means that the sliver of redemption that Hot Rod finds is a sham, and a deeply ironic one, as the one member of the team he was able to quote-unquote save was the one who doomed all the others. It's the kind of dark turn that Furman is so good at pulling off, where layers of deceit and tragedy undermine what would normally be feel-good, inspirational resolutions. But that's enough about that. Let's turn our attention to the art. The artwork across these 5 issues is pretty solid, each in its own way. I will say that I don't think the color work lives up to the high standard of Josh Burcham's work in Stormbringer, and I say that fully aware that Burcham provided colors for Spotlight Shockwave here. And that's not to say that the color work is bad. It's pretty good, actually. It's just not as good. But then they can't all be Stormbringer now, can they? I have more to say about some of the artists than I do about others, so I'll keep it brief where appropriate. Robbie Musso's work on Ultra Magnus is a definite highlight here for me, helping to complete the package on what is my favorite Spotlight in this volume. I'm a big fan of the way he renders Ultra Magnus and Scorponok, but he's no slouch with the organic aliens either. Also, there's something about the way he draws the Transformers' eyes up close. It's like you can see the glass. I don't know, I've always really dug that small detail. Rob Ruffalo, artist for Spotlight Sixshot, is operating very much in that Dreamwave style, the Dreamwave style a la Pat Lee, not Don Figueroa or Alex Milne, that is. And I have to be honest, I don't hate this style as much as some people do. Is it perfect? No. Should it even be considered great? Not really, but it does have its charms, I think. That being said, I find myself a little underwhelmed by the work turned in here. And really, I'm not sure if my ambivalence for Spotlight Sixshot is due to the script or the art or both in tandem, but while I don't think Ruffalo's style is awful per se, I also don't think it does a whole lot to help sell this story. I find the action scenes to be stilted and unexciting, so it's possible the art is doing its fair share of weighing this one down for me. And when it comes to the art in Spotlight Nightbeat, it's probably a little divisive, but I'm a pretty big fan, to put it simply. The interior art is done by the awesome Mark D. Bright, credited in the issue as M.D. Bright, who contributed quite a bit to the medium of comics, doing some art for the Marvel run of G.I. Joe, for example, but is perhaps most notable for leaving a tremendous impact on the world of Transformers with his truly iconic cover to Transformers number 5 from the Marvel years. Everyone knows this cover, right? It's kind of the cover that everyone thinks of. So yeah, I mean, with that in mind, I'm pretty willing to overlook any wonkiness or whatever happened with Nightbeat's antenna in this Spotlight issue. I think what I like most about it is the sense of nostalgia. It feels distinctly modern, but also retro in some ways, evocative of the Marvel Comics years of Transformers. I know not everybody's going to like the bug eyes he gave Optimus on the last page, and I hear you, it's not my favorite visual portrayal of Optimus either, but also, it really reminds me of how he drew Grimlock's eyes on the cover to issue number 8 of the Marvel series, so in this instance, nostalgia wins, meaning I can look the other way. There's something that I just find really charming about some of the art that was produced during the 80s, and this issue really taps into my fondness for that style. Stylistic preferences aside, the layouts and action in Spotlight Nightbeat are all super readable and clear. Everything is organized and designed in such a way that makes for a breezy and lucid reading experience. Despite how you feel about the particulars of the aesthetics, Mark Bright does what he does extremely extremely well, and it was cool finally getting him back for a full issue of Transformers. And that brings us to Nick Roach, who makes his IDW debut doing interiors for the Shockwave and Hot Rod issues. Now, this is early Roach, so it lacks a lot of the finesse of his later output, but the talent on display is still readily apparent. I consider myself a fan of Roach's style, but I do have to mention something that I've never really been able to get on board with, and that's his redesigns for the Dinobots in Spotlight Shockwave. Admittedly, we don't get much of a look at their finalized designs here. We mostly see them in their Beast Wars homage forms with their synthetic skins. We'll see them all in much more detail in future stories, but I'm mentioning it here in this video since this is where their new designs first appeared, and once they lose the skins, they pretty much maintain these designs throughout the IDW run. Most of them are fine in robot mode, although I've never really liked the way Swoop looks, but I've never cared for how most of them are rendered in their Dino modes. Grimlock comes out the best, and then I think he looks pretty good in both modes, although if I'm being totally honest, and I know this is extremely nitpicky, his hands being red has always bothered me for reasons I just can't put my finger on. Regardless of my personal feelings for these designs, they're significant because they're the most radical redesigns of G1 characters that have been done up to this point in the history of the IDW universe. I'll go into this more when we get to the Costa run, but Don Figueroa is who I credit with creating the IDW style, a shift away from traditional G1 representations to something that honestly wasn't super popular at the time, but was ultimately massaged into something more palatable for Phase 2. Nevertheless, we have to give Figueroa credit where it's due. In a sense, he led the charge for the more extensive character redesigns that would become commonplace in Phase 2. But that also means we should give some credit to Roach as well. In Spotlight Shockwave, Roach was the first artist to break away from the updated G1 designs that had been prevalent thus far by giving the Dinobots a more dramatic overhaul in something you could think of as being an early version of what would come to be the IDW style, a proto-IDW style, if you will. So I think some recognition and acknowledgement of that is appropriate. It may not work for everybody, and for me, in the case of the Dinobots, it certainly doesn't, but I can still appreciate its significance and importance in the development of this continuity. It's a notable visual milestone in what would become a fairly daring and adventurous continuity. And I certainly respect the intent and skill behind it. And I think that's a pretty good place to leave things. Thank you for tuning into part 4 of my IDW retrospective. I hope you enjoyed this look at the first 5 Spotlight issues from 2006 and 2007. Which one of these issues is your favorite? Let me know in the comments below. If you liked the video, hit the thumbs up button. And if you haven't subscribed to the channel yet, hit that subscribe button so you can follow along as I put these videos out. And that's it from me for now. Until next time, take care.